World Geography: Russia, Caucasus, Central Asia. The Caucasus and the stands. Here are the learning objectives. 1. What conditions led to the 1917 Russian Revolution and the seizure of power by the Communists? 2. What conditions led to the Cold War? 3. Why does the Caucasus region experience so much political turmoil? 4. Why do you think Central Asia is such a political and economic backwater? Rise and fall of the Soviet Union. Russian Revolution. During World War I, which ran from 1914 to 1918, the Russian people became increasingly angry over the harsh working conditions in the factories and the low wages that were paid. This anger exploded into revolt, and the Russian Revolution in 1917 ended the rule of the Tsars. The Tsars were just another name for a Russian emperor. Vladimir Lenin and the Russian Communist Party, they took control of both the government and the economy. USSR. A few years later, by 1922, the Communist Party had organized all the ethnic peoples of the former Russian Imperial Empire, and they called the new nation the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, or the USSR. Also, it was often referred to as the Soviet Union. The communist leaders of the Soviet Union ruled this new nation from the Moscow capital. And here you have a map of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR, or the Soviet Union, stretching from basically one coast to the other. The Cold War. Following World War II, which ran from 1939 to 1945, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin, he installed pro-Soviet governments in the Eastern European countries that his armies had liberated from Nazi Germany. The United States, for their part, feared a Soviet expansion that might spread communism worldwide. Tensions rose between the United States and the Soviet Union, and the countries aimed nuclear missiles at one another. The conflict, however, is referred to as the Cold War. It never grew into open warfare between the two nations. And here you have a map which demonstrates pretty much the spread of communism. It doesn't just include the USSR, it also includes the Eastern European nations where communism existed in the 1960s. Also includes Mongolia and China, North Korea, Vietnam, North Vietnam, and Cuba off the coast of Florida. Those were all the communist nations in the 1960s. So you can see how the United States might have been a little concerned that communism was on the rise and was spreading. Collapse of communism. By the mid-1980s, Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev, he began to reform the economic and political systems of the Soviet Union. The reforms, however, failed, and this led to the eventual collapse of the communist government and the Soviet Union itself in 1991. Democratic Russia. Once the Soviet Union collapsed, the region divided into several autonomous republics. Russia is the largest and the most powerful of these autonomous republics. Each republic has its own constitution, its own president, and parliament. Each republic can establish their own official language alongside Russian. However, the federal government, based in Moscow, represents the republics in international affairs. In general, the republics are meant to be home to specific ethnic minorities. And here we have a map of Russia today, showing its relationship to surrounding countries. Not quite as big as it once was, but still pretty large. The troubled Caucasus. Central authority collapse. Once the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, central authority throughout the region weakened, and there were increases in crime, in conflict between different ethnic groups, and there was just a rise in general instability. The Caucasus region. In recent times, the Caucasus has experienced some of the most serious violence in the area. The Caucasus straddle the Caucasus Mountains, which stretch between the Black and Caspian Seas. To the north of the mountains lie the Russian republics of Chechnya, Dagestan, Ingushetia, and North Ossetia. South of the Caucasus Mountains are independent nations, not republics of Russia, but these are independent nations south, and they include nations like Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. All in all, the Russians have a strategic interest in this region. It's a route into the agricultural heartland of their nation. It connects Southwest Asia to the European part of Russia. Here you have several maps of the Caucasus region. On the left, you have the entire region, including the Russian republics and the independent nations. At the top, it'll show you the Russian republics, some of the ones I mentioned. And at the bottom right, you have the independent nations of the Caucasus region. Cultural heterogeneity. In an area about the size of California, the inhabitants speak dozens of distinct languages. They belong to 50 different ethnic groups, and they have different religious beliefs. So you can see that the Caucasus region is an area of wide diversity. And people that have so many differences, they don't always get along. The stands of Central Asia. Political, physical features. Central Asia is comprised of 5 former Soviet republics, so they're independent nations now. These nations include Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. Mountains tower to the south and to the east. Grasslands stretch north towards Siberia, and in the south is a large desert. It's a landlocked region with hot summers and harsh cold winters. It's remote, inhospitable, sparsely populated. Okay, here you have a political map of the Central Asian region showing you the different countries. You might want to note the Aral Sea and how it shares its borders with Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. Here you have a physical feature map of Central Asia, so you can identify the mountains and the grasslands and the desert regions. Inhabitants. Each Central Asian nation has its own indigenous population. This population group is usually descended from nomadic tribes, and most of the inhabitants are Sunni Muslim. That's their religious belief. Soviet rule. Before they gained their independence in the 1990s, under Soviet rule, the natives were outnumbered by Russian, Ukrainian, and German immigrants. The Soviet leader had established Central Asia as sort of an internal supplier of its metals and minerals and agricultural produce, particularly cotton. The Soviets tested their nuclear weapons there, and so they left behind abandoned nuclear weapons testing sites and uranium mines, so the area is contaminated with radioactivity. Recovery of the area is going to depend upon economic and political reform. The end. Thank you for listening.